Okay, brilliant. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Adam Haxall. I'm the Strategic Relationships Lead at HCPC, and we're here for a joint session on the standards of conduct, performance and ethics, and also our English language consultation. Yes, thank you for giving up your time today. Without much further ado, I'll pass straight on to my colleague Rosemary, who will introduce herself and then take us through the standards of conduct, performance and ethics. Hi, Rosemary.
Thanks, Adam. Hi, everybody. I'm Rosemary. I'm going to be talking to you about the standards of conduct, performance and ethics today. I'm a policy manager here at the HCPC, and I've been working on these standards since 2022 now. So we'll start today with just a brief introduction about the review that we did to the standards of conduct, performance and ethics. I'll chat about the review and what has changed in terms of the detail. I'll go through that, and then we'll talk about our implementation period, what the HCPC is going to be doing during that time, and what we need registrants to do during that time as well. Excuse me. So we started the review to the standards of conduct, performance and ethics in May 2022. And the standards of conduct, performance and ethics are imperative to what we do. They set out how registrants ought to behave, and they outline what the public should expect from health and care professionals. They help us at the HCPC to make decisions about the character of people who join our register, and they are also used by us if someone raises a concern about a registrant's practice or when things go wrong. So it really is imperative that we review documents like these standards because of how important they are, and we need to make sure that they're fit for purpose and that they're up to date in terms of how, in terms of current practice. So our review to the standards consisted of a pre-consultation survey and workshops with each stakeholder group as well. So those stakeholder groups included yourselves, employers, also professional bodies, registrants themselves, service users, and trade unions as well. Alongside that, we did desk research and we talked to other regulators as well, like the GMC and the NMC, and also other stakeholders like the Greener NHS and the Office of the Chief Sustainability Officer. So through all of these activities, we drafted proposed revisions and released these for public consultation, and that was in March of this year. We received 218 responses to the consultation, and 190 responses were from individuals and 28 responses were from organisations. Of the 190 individual responses, 84% of those were HCPC registered professionals. So a lot of our consultation responses came from registrants themselves. There's a lot of interest from registrants. We also carried out 6 thematic workshops during the consultation. And we had over 200 participants attend these workshops. So before I go into what has changed, I just want to talk a little bit about what is the same. So the changes that we've made are not an overhaul of the standards of conduct, performance and ethics. So there's a number of things that remain the same. First of all, there are still 10 standards. The headings of these standards remain the same, along with the structure and the purpose of the standards as well. Where we have made changes is in the detail of the standards, and we've done this using 5 key themes. They are equality, diversity and inclusion, communication, duty of candour, upskilling and training responsibilities, and managing health and disabilities in the workplace. Many of these changes are about implementing more active language for registrants and making their responsibilities clearer and highlighting the importance of certain values, such as being open and honest and practicing safely and effectively. In addition to these changes, we've also made changes to our guidance on social media that sits alongside the standards. We're also beginning to review the remaining pieces of guidance that sit under the standards, and we're working with our explanatory materials working group to create more materials to support the standards. So, for example, that includes perhaps a easy read version, but also looking at the case studies that we provide on our website and things like that as well. In response to our consultation question on sustainability, we've committed to creating a sustainable practice hub. I'll mention that again a little bit later on. For now, I'll go into a little bit more detail about some of the key changes that we've made. So the first theme that we'll explore today is equality, diversity and inclusion. Many of the changes that we've made here are about making the language in our standards clearer and more active. The changes that we've made to Standard 1.3 ensure that service users are better supported by registrants to make informed decisions. Originally, the standard read, "You must encourage and help service users, where appropriate, to maintain their own health and well-being, and support them so they can make informed decisions." You can see the new standard on the slide, and where we instead refer to empowering and enabling service users. Our changes to Standard 1.4 ensure that registrants understand that for consent to be valid, it must be voluntary and informed. And the person consenting must have the capacity to make the decision. Originally, the standard read, "You must make sure that you have consent from service users or another appropriate authority before you provide care, treatment or other services." Now, as you can see on the slide, we refer to valid consent, which is voluntary and informed, and we also refer to ensuring that service users have the capacity to make the decision. The changes that we've made to this section of the standard of Standard 1 are all about challenging discrimination. We've added a new Standard 1.5 that retains a simple duty to not discriminate, and that is by including a duty to treat people fairly. For Standard 1.6, we've updated the language to make it more active. The changes to Standard 1.6 ensure that registrants are being asked to take action to ensure they are meeting equality, diversity and inclusion commitments. Originally, the standard read, "You must not discriminate against service users, carers or colleagues by allowing your personal views to affect your professional relationships or the care, treatment or other services that you provide." Now, the standard refers to taking action and ensuring personal values, biases and beliefs do not lead to discrimination or detrimentally impact care. Again, you can see that on the slide. Changes to Standard 1.7 provide registrants with clearer requirements to raise concerns about colleagues whom they think are discriminating against service users, carers or other colleagues. The standard previously read, "You must challenge colleagues if you think that they have discriminated against or are discriminating against service users, carers and colleagues." The revised standard refers to raising concerns instead, and that registrants must follow relevant internal procedures in their workplace. In the next section of Standard 1, which is all about maintaining appropriate boundaries, we've added 4 new standards. These are 1.8 through to 1.11. Standard 1.8 introduces active language for registrants to consider the potential impact of their position of power and trust in social and personal settings. Similarly, Standard 1.9 introduces active language around setting professional boundaries, specifically requiring registrants to take action to set these boundaries with service users and/or carers and also colleagues. Standard 1.10 requires registrants to use appropriate methods of communication in their provision of care. The new Standard 1.11 makes it clear that registrants must ensure that any personal relationships between colleagues should not influence a registrant's professional decisions. Now, Standard 1.12 is an updated standard. It was previously standard 1.7 and it read, "You must keep your relationships with service users and carers professional." The revised standard refers to registrants not abusing their position and sets out specific types of relationship that registrants should ensure are not founded upon an abuse of their power. For example, personal, sexual, emotional, or financial relationships should not be founded upon an abuse of their power as a health and care professional. It has also added reference to colleagues in the standard. So, as I mentioned earlier, and as you might have gathered as we've gone through those changes to Standard 1, you'll notice there are some key ways in which we've changed this standard. So we've got more active language, and this is in line with changes that we've made to the standards of proficiency. And this supports registrants to be autonomous and caring professionals. We've also made some changes specifically in response to consultation feedback. So, for example, following feedback that challenging colleagues, as stated in previous Standard 1.6, could put registrants at risk of harm. Therefore, we changed the language to refer to raising concerns instead, and also referred to registrants' internal procedures in their workplace. We've also made updates around points of clarity. For example, in our original proposed standard 1.8, we've changed the wording from "be aware" to "consider" in the final version. So I'm just going to take a pause here to have a look at our Q&A function just to see if there's anybody who's posted a question. So we do have our Q&A function open. You can also post in the chat, I believe. And I think some people are having some audio issues. I hope that's not on my side. Great. I hope those are resolved soon. So yeah, we do have the Q&A function open. So if you do have any questions, please do pop them in there. And the chat is open as well. I've had a look. I can't see any questions coming in at the moment. So I'll move on and we'll have another opportunity for questions at after the next section of on communication. So our theme on communication is all about how registrants communicate with colleagues, service users and carers. This mostly relates to Standard 2. Under Communicate with Service Users and Carers, we have made changes to Standard 2.4 to better reflect statutory principles to meet service users and their carers' communication needs. Originally, Standard 2.4 read, "You must make sure that where possible, arrangements are made to meet service users and carers' language and communication needs." We now reference, as you can see on the slide, taking all practicable steps to meet service users' needs. We've also added new Standard 2.5. This makes clear that in all communication with service users and carers, registrants must communicate responsibly. Under the Work with Colleagues section of Standard 2, we have added a new Standard 2.8. It requires registrants to treat colleagues in a professional manner, showing them respect and consideration. We've also added Standard 2.9. Similarly to Standard 2.5, this new standard states that registrants must use all forms of communication appropriately and responsibly when communicating with colleagues. In other words, it's not where you say something, it's about what you say. Our standards on social media and networking sites have expanded considerably as a result of our review. Standard 2.10 is our previous Standard 2.7 on social media. That read, "You must use all forms of communication appropriately and responsibly, including social media and networking sites." Instead, the new standard is more specific. It states that registrants must use media sharing networks and social networking sites responsibly. We've also added 2 new standards to this section, Standard 2.11 and 2.12. The new Standard 2.11 tackles the increased occurrence of misinformation on social media. It ensures that registrants understand they have a responsibility to check the accuracy of the information that they share online. The new Standard 2.12 ensures that registrants' responsibilities to maintain professional boundaries and protect service user information on social media is stated clearly. Many of our changes about communicating with service users, carers and colleagues originated from stakeholder feedback. So, for example, the concern that survey respondents and workshop participants had for how registrants treat colleagues is represented in new Standard 2.8, specifically stating how we expect registrants to interact with their colleagues professionally and respectfully. We also responded to stakeholder concerns about misinformation by adding a specific standard intended to tackle this issue. Okay, coming back to the questions. I can see some people are still having a few technical issues, and as Adam has said in the chat, we will be sharing the information with you after the event as well. If you can't hear, if you're having trouble, don't worry. We'll be able to send a version of the slides through and the and this webinar as well, so don't worry about it.
So we've got a question in on the Q&A regarding 2.12 and whether it will apply to all social media accounts or only those in which the registrant is identifiable.
Right, so yeah, we wouldn't be able to hold a registrant accountable really in, for where they're not identifiable on a social media account. However, if they do become identifiable later, then anything that they do say does need to be in line with our standards. And so I think it's a little bit of a tricky question, that one really, because one of the things that we say in our social media guidance, for example, is thinking carefully about what can become public later, for example. So it's similar in that you need to be careful, registrants need to be careful about how they could become identifiable later if they are saying if they are posting on social media and it's offensive, for example. I can't see any other questions coming in. I hope that answers that question there. It really is. We really do are kind of focusing on that sort of idea of being careful with what you say rather than where you say it and things like that. Oh yeah, Maheshi, I can see the next question coming through. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so these are standards that are valid from September 2024. So they're going to be coming into effect in September 2024.
And I think that ties us into a question we've had also in the chat function of whether the standards are applicable from 2024 or if it has been, or if we're able to apply them by September 2023.
Oh yeah, so I mean, registrants can start to apply these standards now to their practice for sure, but what we won't be doing is assessing registrants or expecting registrants to apply these standards now. We will be expecting registrants to apply the standards from September 2024. We'll go into a little bit more detail about that later in the session as well, about what we expect from registrants during the implementation period and also then in September 2024. Okie dokie, so I think that's all the questions we have so far, so I'll move on to the next one. Is that all right, Maheshi? Have you seen any other questions anywhere? None I've missed?
I can't see anything else on my side, so I think you're right to carry on to the next set of slides.
Awesome, thank you. So duty of candour is our next theme. This is all about what we expect registrants to do when things go wrong, and that is to be open and honest. We have made changes to Standard 8.1 that make the processes that registrants must follow clearer and better aligned with HCPC online materials on the duty of candour. We've also added wording to reflect the variety of contexts that registrants work in. For example, where registrants do not have direct access to a service user or carer, they are expected to inform their lead clinician of what has gone wrong. We've removed apologising from Standard 8.1 and set it out as a separate standard, and that is Standard 8.2. This highlights the centrality of apologising when things go wrong and recognises apologising as a professional duty. This better aligns with our guidance. The changes that we've made to Standard 8.1 and the new Standard 8.2 mostly originate from stakeholder feedback. That includes to make Standard 8.1 clearer and to better align the standard with our online materials. We also heard from some registrants that they would not have direct access to service users and carers to contact them, and that a standard requiring them to inform service users or carers would be difficult to meet. And that's why we added that reference to a lead clinician in Standard 8.2. And that lead clinician should have the ability to get in touch with service users and carers after something has gone wrong. Okie dokie, coming back to the questions again.
Yep, I think we've got one in the Q&A that's just come in. So do these standards align closely with standards set by NMC or GMC, for example, to ensure parity across healthcare environments?
So earlier on, I talked about our stakeholder engagement and the conversations that we had during our pre-consultation phase of the review, and that included conversations with the NMC and the GMC about their standards and how they've been updating their standards as well, and the things that are coming up that are uncommon for us. However, because of the way in which the NMC work, the way in which the GMC works, and how we work, it's all quite separate. And we also are quite different from the NMC and GMC in that we regulate 15 different professions. So we have been very careful to ensure that our standards are specific to our registrants. And so there are differences across the standards set by the NMC and the GMC. For example, the NMC refers to kindness in their standards. We've not added that into our standards, for example, because in our stakeholder engagement, that wasn't found to be something that would be helpful for our registrants and their service users. So there's differences like that, but in general, we've tried to make sure that we're thinking about parity across healthcare environments.
Great. I think I can't see anything else in the Q&A or chat function, but I do want to draw attention to the links also in the meeting chat where you can find more information on all of these areas that are covered today.
Awesome. Thank you, Maheshi. So I'll move on to our next theme, and that is upskilling and training responsibilities. This relates to Standard 3 and registrants' scope of practice. The changes that we have made to Standard 3.1 make the relationship between safe and effective practice and scope of practice clear. Originally, the standard read, you must keep within your scope of practice by only practicing in the areas you have appropriate knowledge and skills for. The standard now includes specific reference to safely and effectively. We also added a new standard, Standard 3.2, to ensure that registrants understand the actions that they can take to widen their scope of practice. This standard references undertaking additional training to update one's knowledge, skills, and experience. Standard 3.3 is updated from previous wording, and that's you must refer a service user to another practitioner if the care, treatment, or other services they need are beyond your scope of practice. We've expanded this to ascertain that this person must hold the appropriate knowledge, skills, and experience to meet the needs of the service user safely and effectively. It thereby specifically sets out that they must hold the appropriate scope of practice to provide the service being referred. Okie dokie, didn't expect to come straight onto the questions. So we're back onto the questions again. I think I've actually slipped around with the slides. So I'll quickly go through the reasons for the changes that we've made. The changes that we've made relating to upskilling and training, like I said, they mostly relate to scope of practice. And our registrants often ask questions about scope of practice, specifically what they need to do to widen their scope of practice in the instance that somebody is asking them to take on a task that's outside of their scope of practice, for example. How do they then in future take on that task? And the changes that we've made set out to make this clear and to help registrants understand that what's central to scope of practice is safety and effectiveness. So where they're looking to widen their scope of practice, they need to be looking at gaining the knowledge, skills, and experience to perform that task or that role in a way that is safe and effective. Okay, now I'm coming back to questions.
Great. I can't see anything in the Q&A so far, Rosemary. But I do think we have a question in the chat box regarding apologies. So from the previous.
Okay.
Yes. Are we okay to go into that? So
yeah.
So the question is there ever an issue with apologies under the new changes?
An issue with apology. So I think one of the things that we have talked a little bit about with in our other workshops is first of all, registrants can sometimes get a bit worried about apologising in case it is a signifier for liability. And now in the UK, in a health and care context, apologising does not legally mean that you've admitted any liability. So we've highlighted that to registrants throughout the review and throughout our workshops on the new revised standards to say that actually have confidence to apologise, and our inclusion of giving an apology and having that as a separate standard is there to give registrants that confidence as well, to say that actually they have a professional duty to apologise when things go wrong. So I think that can sometimes be an issue, that sort of confidence to apologise. And I think that the new revised standards will really help with that.
Great. We've also had another one on, is there any incident report format? I will say that I don't think as the regulator we provide that incident report format, but it is something that your organisation should have already to help record the details of an event that's occurred in the workplace. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Rosemary.
Yeah, that's correct. So different employers, you guys may have incident reports that you need your employees to fill out. You may have different procedures that they need to follow, but we don't get involved in that side of things. We don't, our registrants aren't required to fill out any specific form or anything like that for when things go wrong. They do just need to meet their standard 8.1 and 8.2.
Great. I think we've had another question coming on the Q&A, which we'll turn to. So who decides what a registrant's scope of practice is, and what happens if there is a difference in opinion?
Okay, so we don't set scope of practice at the HCPC, and the standards of conduct, performance and ethics are really focused on how we expect registrants to behave in the workplace. What will set the standard registrant's scope of practice is their profession, and that they can carry out their tasks and that they have the knowledge, skills and experience to carry out those tasks in a way that is safe and effective.
Great, thanks. And we've just had another one that's come in also on the meeting chat too. So just to clarify, apologising does not mean that it admits you are liable, but it is a professional duty for when things go wrong.
That is correct. So for our registrants, apologising is a professional duty under Standard 8.2. It does not admit liability in a legal sense. So it doesn't mean it is you are at fault specifically. There can be many reasons why something has gone wrong, but it is a professional duty to apologise to a service user or carer that something has gone wrong and that they have been impacted by that.
Great. And I think I can't see anything else on this side.
Okay, great. Thanks, Maheshi, and thanks everybody for your questions. I'm going to move on to our next theme. And that's the final theme that we're going to talk about today, and that's managing existing health conditions and disabilities in the workplace. So here we've added a new standard 6.3 to make it clear that a registrant's responsibilities are to actively assess the impact that their health has on their practice. Following consultation, we added or asking an appropriate health and care professional to assess to standard 6.3. We've also added that in the circumstances that a registrant is unsure of their ability to make an assessment themselves, they should refer to another health and care practitioner to make a health assessment on their behalf. Standard 6.4 is updated from reading, "You must make changes to how you practice or stop practicing if your physical or mental health may affect your performance or judgment or put others at risk for any other reason." And we've changed that to specifically mention safe and effective practice. It sets out that a registrant is responsible for ensuring adjustments are made to their practice to make it safe and effective. It also makes clear that if their physical or mental health detrimentally impacts their practice and it is not possible to make adjustments, they must stop practicing. So we've made these changes following feedback from some of our registrants, specifically some of our disabled registrants who said that the previous standard 6.3 could make their registration more laborious and created confusion about when they should refer themselves to the HCPC. In response to that concern, we have changed 6.3 to make it clearer. In response to a concern about registrants' ability to assess their own health, we also made the addition to standard 6.3 that I made earlier and that I mentioned earlier. That's the addition that a registrant can refer to another health and care professional if they are unsure of their ability to make an assessment of their own. Okie dokie, I'm going to come back to the questions.
So we've got one question that's come up in the chat box. Pharmacists currently prescribe medication. So would this not be outside their scope of practice?
So that's a little bit too specific for me to answer. I don't work on that specific part of policy. So if you want the person who's asked that question, please do get in touch with the policy team. You can ask us that question on our email address. We can pop that in the chat, but also it will come up on a slide later on in the session as well.
Great, and I don't think there's anything else in the Q&A, but we'll give people just a few more seconds if there is any other questions.
Okay, great, awesome. Yeah, there will be a couple of other opportunities to ask questions as well as we go on. I can't see anything coming through, so let's move on and then we will come back to questions in a little bit. If you think of anything, please do put it into the Q&A and we can come round to it at the next point for questions. So a final area that I mentioned a little bit earlier as well that I wanted to talk about today is sustainability. So we've not added a new standard on sustainability or made any specific changes that relate to practicing sustainably. However, we did include sustainability as part of our consultation, specifically asking our consultation respondents about whether they wanted to see a standard on sustainability in the future. We had a lot of respondents talking about sustainability in our consultation. A lot of people who were quite positive about sustainability and there being a standard on sustainability, and a few people who were quite worried about that as well, who didn't quite engage with sustainability and didn't and who weren't familiar with sustainability in a health and care context. And so what we have committed to doing is reviewing sustainability as part of our standards of education and training review in 2024. And we'll also be creating an area of the HCPC website that discusses practicing sustainably, and that's our Sustainable Practice Hub. Those pages will provide resources on sustainability in general. They'll also provide resources on sustainability in the health and care context. And they'll talk a little bit about different ways in which our registrants can practice more sustainably as well, just giving people a few ideas if they're interested. And here we come back to some questions before we move on to talk a little bit about the implementation period.
Great. I can't see anything just yet. Okay, we've just had a question come in. So should potential anaesthesia associate students necessarily be registered with the HCPC as an anaesthetic ODP?
That is, again, quite a specific question that I'm not going to be able to answer today, I'm afraid. I don't have that information. But again, please do refer to our website and also you can email the policy team if you cannot find the information on our website.
Great. So we've got a question in on the Q&A and it's on 2.8. So it says, you must treat your colleagues in a professional manner to show them respect and consideration. So how can this be enforced if management ignore bullying?
So these standards are here for registrants to know what they need, what we expect of them and how we expect them to behave. Where somebody witnesses bullying in a workplace context and that person who is doing the bullying is a HCPC registrant, you can raise a concern either through your internal procedures. You can also raise a concern with us as well if that person is a HCPC registrant. I also would recommend using these standards as well for registrants, specifically using these standards as well to advocate for themselves. So where management is ignoring bullying, registrants can use these standards to say, actually, it's really my duty to report bullying. It's my duty to report my concern about somebody being bullied, for example. And as I said again, if somebody isn't meeting our standards, and if our registrants witness another registrant bullying somebody, they can raise a concern with the HCPC.
Great, so I can't see any more in the Q&A and in the meeting chat. So, okay to go on to the next set of slides.
Great, thank you, Maheshi. So I'm going to talk about our implementation period now. So for us, our implementation period is all about ensuring all of our stakeholders understand the revisions and know their obligations to implement them before the standards come into effect in September 2024. So implementation runs from when we published the standards, that was back in October, and all the way until September 2024. During that time, we will be carrying out a range of training activities, for example, workshops with our external and internal stakeholders. We'll also be reviewing the guidance that sits alongside the standards, such as our guidance on confidentiality, and also the online materials that explain the standards. And we'll be developing explanatory materials to go alongside the standards as well, to ensure that the standards are accessible to a wide range of readers. So today is the last of our workshops on the revised standards for this year. You can find recordings of the public webinars on our website, and we'll also have more workshops exploring the themes to the changes that we've made in the new year. Those again will be on equality, diversity, inclusion, communication, duty of candour, upskilling and training responsibilities, and managing health and disabilities in the workplace. And just going to come to some questions briefly, and then we'll go on to what we expect registrants to do.
Great, thanks, Rosemary. I can't see any more questions coming in. I can see some specific questions for possibly our registration department, so I'll put in a helpful email there to direct your queries.
Perfect, thank you, Maheshi. Okay, so during the implementation phase, we also expect registrants to be preparing themselves. When the standards come into effect on 1st of September 2024, we expect registrants to be able to apply the standards. This includes anyone who is entering the register for the first time, and we expect those new registrants to undertake CPD and develop their skills and knowledge of the new standards. As I said, we have a number of workshops and resources that registrants can engage with to prepare themselves, and they can find these on our website. And these are some of the documents that we have available on our website as well. Our key documents include the revised standards and themselves, and the social media guidance that we've revised as well. You can also find information about the consultation in our consultation outcome document, and also how we considered people with protected characteristics when making these updates. You can read about that in our quality impact assessment. We also have a news story that summarises our review, and a document that sets out the key changes that we've made against the previous standards as well. And any last questions before I hand over to our next session?
I think we are all okay on this side. Nothing new on the chat or the Q&A.
Awesome, thank you very much. So yeah, thanks everybody for listening to me talk about the standards of conduct, performance and ethics. If you do have any questions that come up about these revised standards, please do check out the website in the first instance, your question may be answered there. And if it isn't, then please do get in touch with the policy team and I'll be able to come back to you and chat to you a little bit more. Thanks, everybody. I'll hand over to Tom now.
Thank you so much for that, Rosemary. Really excellent stuff and quite a lot to absorb in there, but I hope that that was useful for everybody. I'm here to speak to you today about some proposed changes to our English language requirements for people who are applying via our international route to join the register. My name is Tom Miller. I'm a policy manager in our policy and standards team. And I'm joined by Madeline Connor, who's going to be helping out with the presentation today, who's also working on this and particularly specialising in the equalities impact assessment part of it. I will stop for questions a bit like Rosemary during the session, but I think there's a bit of a shorter deck and there's quite a lot of questions at the end as well. So there'll be plenty of opportunities to get in touch and ask something. Again, we'll use the Q&A function for taking those questions. So if you could put your questions in there, that would be really helpful, although we will try to keep an eye on the chat as well. And I'm just waiting for our slides to come up there. So give me a second before we launch into things. There we go. That looks like a promising preview circle.
Can you see them okay?
Yeah.
That's it. You got.
I cannot, unfortunately. I'll take a look at my own copy. It's probably the best way to get through. Give me 1 second, folks. Sorry. Yeah, I can see it on the screen now anyway. That's good. Yeah, okay, so I've got a title slide up there that I can currently see, folks. So if we skip on to the first one, that would be great. Fab, brilliant. There's always a hitch with these things, folks, so apologies, but we will get through. As I said earlier, we are reviewing our requirements that we set for people that are coming through the international route onto our register. What we do want to make clear is that this is only going to apply to people that currently have English language requirements to meet, and that means people through that international route. So it's not going to apply to UK applicants to join the register. It's also not going to apply to people that use the Swiss mutual recognition route that came out of the various Brexit implications. So that is separate to this as well. This is only for people using the international route. But I'll talk a little bit about the requirements that we have in place, why we're revising those, and a little bit onto what we're proposing. The consultation on this is currently live and will be running into January. We'll put a slide at the end of this just so that you can find the consultation and hopefully respond. It's really important to us to hear from employers and employer organisations because we want to make sure that we're getting a balance of all of the various different stakeholders here. So far, about 2/3 of the people that have answered our consultation have been people that are applying at present. So there's a heavy weighting in that direction. That's sort of something that we would expect because those are individuals, but we need to hear from stakeholder organisations such as yourself. Without further ado, I'll go into the presentation now. So our current requirements, why is it that we even have English language requirements in the first place? Well, it's a statutory requirement for us as a regulator to have those in place. And it's also a standards requirement for registrants to be able to communicate effectively. So it's in there as standard 7, and within that standard there's a requirement on English language. And why are both of those things in place? Well, it's necessary for safe and effective practice for people to be able to speak English to a good standard, and our role here is to decide A, what that standard should be, and B, how it's evidenced. The changes that we're proposing about how it's evidenced rather than us changing the standard that we expect from people, but that's something we'll flesh out a little bit as we go through. How does it work at the moment? Well, at present, international applicants can self-declare that English is their first language. So that would mean, have they spoken primarily English growing up? Do they at the moment? Is that in their family background? And we do expect people to show us evidence for that. But it's obviously a fairly trust-based kind of system, and it relies on us where we think there's a problem with that, going back and challenging that effectively. And therefore, we would need evidence to do so, to go and challenge someone. And the second way where people can't demonstrate that English is their first language, the route that we ask people to go down is to complete one of 2 approved English tests, which at the moment, the ones that we approve are IELTS and TOEFL. I'm not going to read you out the full acronyms, but they're quite different. So IELTS is a British Council-based test that's used quite widely internationally. TOEFL is one that was actually developed out of admissions for American universities. And so a lot of these tests come into being in different ways, but what we do is try and compare those and make sure they're on a similar standard and that they are able to support our standards requirements that I talked about just before. And we will accept, as well as those 2 tests, qualifications that people can prove is equivalent. And what this means at the moment is that sometimes we're approached by somebody that's sat another English language test and they'll say, well, I got this grade on this English language test. And our registrations team will then have to go away and do the work of comparing that grade and making sure that it's at a similar standard to the 2 approved tests that we have in place. And so those ad hoc ones can generate significant kind of checking work for our registrations team. And part of what we're proposing should hopefully simplify that a little bit. So we're consulting on 4 proposals at the moment that would fundamentally change the system. The consultation opened last month, and as I said, it will be closing in January. And yeah, I've already said some of this, but the changes would only apply to new applications using the international route. So one implication of that, I talked a little bit about UK registrations not being covered by this, but the other thing is readmissions, because readmissions use the UK route. And so we'd be talking really about those new applications. And so what about the consultation? What does that mean? Well, this is a serious consultation, so what people say to us will actually be taken into our considerations, and we will adapt our proposals if people come back with feedback that suggests that we need to move in a radically different direction. We will look at evidence that can support that and what the implications would be, and we'll consider those things. And so it's really important that we hear from everybody, because without hearing from you, we don't have the evidence that we would need to adapt and improve those proposals. I saw a question come in via the chat there, but we'll come on to questions in a second when I've been through the proposals. If we could skip on to the next slide, that would be great. So yeah, what do the proposals do? So the first thing is we would expect this to align us a bit better with other regulators. People will be aware that there have been some recent revisions to this. Some regulators in health and social care adapted their requirements for the COVID period. Others, like NMC, have done a kind of overhaul of all of their requirements and policies around this. And we want to make sure that we're keeping pace with the sector, really, and that we're not kind of getting completely bogged down in past proposals from a long time ago. It has been a while since our current policies have been revised, so it seems like an opportune time to do this. But there are opportunities here as well that we want to take advantage of, and this is a key reason for us revising as well. So creating new pathways for people that don't speak English as their first language, but who can otherwise practice safely and effectively. It seems counterintuitive that what your first language is can get you straight through onto the register, you know, assuming that you've met all of the other registration requirements. But if you speak English to exactly the same standard, but it is your second language, then you'll find that a lot more problematic under the current system. That to us seems a bit arbitrary and doesn't really make a tremendous amount of sense. So we think that we can make that fairer by simply levelling the playing field and say, listen, if your English is to a good enough standard, you'll be treated the same by us, and we think you can practice safely and effectively. That's good enough for you to proceed with the rest of the registration requirements. It should move the application away from subjective decision making. So that point I made about challenging self-declarations of English as a first language and the kind of slightly ad hoc nature of that sometimes. The idea of to compare individuals' qualifications where they're not one of our 2 approved providers. There are a few areas here where, in our view, we have the space to get rid of some personal judgment really from the process, some of the judgment that our registrations team have to make, and make sure that we're being a bit more clear and transparent with potential registrants, applicants in our language about what we'd expect from them. And I think an advantage of this as well is the focus on the country where applicants and their qualifications rather than the country of birth or where they live when applying. So we'll talk a little bit in a second about the proposals. One of them is a country list to replace that self-declaration of English as a first language. And it's much better for us to simply say, well, you come from you are coming from a country and have taken a qualification in a country where English is the most widely spoken language. And your course was delivered in English, and for us that's enough evidence for you to go through. So it's not necessarily that everything about what we're proposing is about tightening or loosening. I think that a lot of it really is about rationalising and making sure that what we're doing is fair and proportionate, that it's clear, and that the system is robust. Let's move on to the next slide. So here are the proposals. So the first one of them is the ending of self-declaration, which I've spoken about a bit, of English as the first language. And the second proposal is very heavily joined to that because it kind of replaces it. So instead, we'd introduce a list of qualifying countries, and these would be majority English-speaking countries. And rather than it being about whether you're a citizen of that country or you live there or whatever else, we'd again try to make that a bit more fair and objective by asking people to show that their primary qualification was taken there. And what is your primary qualification? Well, we haven't nailed down that definition yet, and that might be something that you want to think about when you come back in the consultation. But the practical working definition of that is really it's a qualification that enables you to practice your profession. The third proposal that we've got in there is to expand our list of test providers, but also to make that list exhaustive. So we know that there are a lot of tests out there. Some of them are used and accepted by other regulators. Some of them are tests that registrants or employers or professional bodies are telling us should be accepted but are not accepted. And we want to make sure really that we're allowing people the maximum choice in all of those, and that we already have to hand a comparison of the standard met and the method used in those tests. We want to make sure essentially that we don't rely on a system that is in any way ad hoc, with people coming to us and saying, well, will you compare my individual qualification? It's far better for us to simply list out all of the qualifications that we will accept and be clear about that. So that's what that would look like to us. We are agnostic, again, at the moment about which qualification should go on that. So it may well be that we only end up with the 2 that we've got at present, or we might have a list of 10, who can possibly say. But what we do want to hear from employers is which qualifications you think are useful, and we'll be asking other stakeholders that same question as well. And we will then go away and take a bit of a deep dive into the evidence behind those qualifications, the comparability and their suitability, because they do have to be robust ones that people can't cheat their way through, for example. And they've got to be focused on things that would allow people to practice safely and effectively. So there's a little bit of due diligence work for us after the consultation closes to firm up what that proposal looks like in practice. But what we're asking about is the question in principle of, do we expand it and should it be exhaustive? And we're interested really in your view about what should be included on there as well. And the fourth one we've got here, this is kind of 2 proposals a bit bundled together as one, because this is about your previous work if you're an applicant. So we would we would allow previous registration in listed countries or supervised UK work experience as evidence of your English language proficiency. So the first one of those would be, we talked about the country list in proposal 2 there. If you'd been a registered professional in health and care in one of those countries and you'd had a substantial period of work delivering in English, then we would say, okay, well, there's no point in us sending you for an English test, so you can proceed and carry out the rest of the registration requirements. And likewise, the same is true really for supervised UK work experience. And for this, I want to be very specific about it. So for that supervision, at the moment, we're talking about by a HCPC professional. Again, you might have different views on this. So if you've got people in your in your professional experience who maybe are switching between health and care professions, and they've been supervised by registrants of other regulators, for example? Is that something that we should be considering? And those are things that you might want to consider when you come back to us and answer, because those are things that we've done a little bit of thinking about ourselves. But at the moment, it would be an HCPC registered professional signing off that you had been working and delivering in English. I think now it would be helpful for us to just quickly go to questions for people. So I've noticed there are a couple in the chat, and I think maybe also some Q&A questions as well, but I'm going to rely on Madeline and our team to read those out for me, and I'll try my best to answer them.
Yep, of course. So in the Q&A chat, there's one that says, when you say international route, does it include those who have dual citizenship, for example, or living in the UK with a spouse visa?
Yeah, so I think the international route application is really about where your practice has been, is my understanding of it. I think we may have to come back to you in a little bit more detail on that, though, because it's really the sort of question that I wouldn't be comfortable answering myself. This is really something who falls into which route is really a question for our registrations team. So if we could take your details, perhaps send us a private message, or we'll leave you an email address at the end as well, and you can get back to us on that, and then we can be a bit more specific in our answer about that. But yeah, like, there is information on our website as well about which route you're better to use, which one you're eligible for, and it would only apply to people that are eligible under the current international route. So sorry that I can't be a bit more detailed about that, but we'll try to find the answer for you.
I can post some information in the chat as well about the international applications, and hopefully that will be helpful. But also in the chat, we've got a question about internationally trained radiographers currently have to sit for an English test. What happens to registrants who got their qualifications in the English language?
Sorry, Madeline, you've got a little bit of background noise there. I was wondering if you could repeat the question. Apologies.
Sorry, I'm in the office today, so it's a bit busy.
Yeah.
This is about radiographers who currently have to sit for an English test, and what happens to registrants who got their qualifications in English.
Yeah, okay, so if you got your qualifications in English in one of those qualifying countries, then you wouldn't be required by the HCPC to sit an English test, is the first thing. The second thing is, if your radiography English test, so I'm assuming you're asking about an English test that work gets you to sit here. And if that is one of the tests that arrives on our list, then again, you will have passed our English language requirements registration if you're coming through the international route. So a really important thing here is that it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be duplicating tests, and we want to make sure that there's the minimum of duplication. For that reason, I mean, this is a really good example of why it'd be very helpful for people to respond formally to the consultation, because if there's a particular English language test that radiographers are asked to complete for professional reasons, leaving aside HCPC requirements, we as HCPC would love to know what that test is, and then we can go away and see if we can try to get that onto our list, and avoid people having to sit 2 English tests, because that would clearly be a bit of an absurd situation and something worth avoiding, I think. So yeah, I mean, the problem with some of the questions, I suppose, is because we haven't closed the consultation yet, we're not able to say exactly what would be on that list. But what I am saying is that this is your chance to influence what will be on that list, I suppose. So let us know what that test is, and we will go away and look into it and see if it's something that we can include.
Thank you. So the next question is about whether the tests are done online or in person, so that we know who is actually taking them.
Yeah, so online testing at the moment, it's been a bit of an area of controversy, because I think there are different ways of verifying whether a person whether a person has completed that test fairly, and different levels of security for different tests. So at the moment, we've obviously got the IELTS and TOEFL tests, and all of the requirements for that are on our website. So you can look into that. We don't have a position at the moment on whether or not tests should be only online or in person. But again, we're interested in your viewpoint about that, because people will have, I should imagine, quite different views on it. There will be some people that think, okay, well, I don't really believe in online tests because they're too gameable, and there'll be other people that will think, okay, well, this will increase people's access to those tests. So yes, it would be good to hear from you about that, I think, just to flip it around a little bit. As I said, we could end up with 10 different tests that are possible to take and be satisfied with security requirements for some of them and not for others. So yeah, again, it's helpful to know if there are any specific ones that you would recommend or recommend against.
Just on a similar vein, then I'll sort of group some of these questions together. Someone has asked, how will we ensure that the tests will all be of the same standard, and will an external standard setting exercise be undertaken?
So we're probably a little bit too early to answer that, but I can give you an idea of where our direction of travel is. So after we've completed the consultation, we'll then go away and analyse the results. And one of the things that we'll do once we've produced an analysis is we will go to our Education and Training Committee, and they will be provided with a steer and asked for direction on how we do that. But what I can say with certainty, the first thing is that we will be asking for the same standard of proficiency in English. That's probably not the best word to use if you're HCPC, but the same level of proficiency in the English language that we currently ask for from our two providers. So you're talking about 7.5, I think it is, and then there's a slightly higher one for speech and language therapists at IELTS, and then there's a separate score for TOEFL, which is scored very differently, but these are set against what they call the Common European Framework as a baseline for making sure that those standards are comparable. And so from our point of view, we want to make sure that we're acting in line with that framework. So we will have to go away and carry out an exercise comparing those standards. Whether or not we'll be going out to do that and doing it independently is something that I can't answer at this point, because that decision will get made by the Education and Training Committee. But I think it's been an example of good practice in the rest of the sector. That has tended to happen. So we're willing to examine all options for it, really. But we are aware of it. It's very much on our plate. So thank you for raising it.
So again, just on a similar sort of vein, talking about the tests, are the tests written tests, or do they include a spoken module?
Yeah, they're normally a mixture of modules, and we're keen to make sure that people can use all aspects of the English language for their practice. Obviously, we've got 15 professions, and some of them are much more public facing than others. So biomedical scientists, for example, tend to be a lot less public facing than paramedics or physiotherapists, right? But all the same, we do think it's important that reading, speaking, writing are all aspects that somebody is proficient in. And for us, we want to make sure that we're selecting tests for our list that kind of fit those criteria. So these are examples of some of the things we might consider as criteria for tests that go on that list for proposal 3. And if you have thoughts about, what are the criteria that we should be adopting to include something on that list, we want to hear that as well. You don't just have to tell us which tests you think are good. Please feel free to tell us why.
So I think you've kind of already answered this one, but someone has asked, could international applicants give OET in replacement to IELTS?
Potentially, yeah. And OET is anecdotally, again, I could tell you a little bit about some of the responses that have been coming in. OET has been mentioned a few times by people that have been coming back to the consultation. There are 5 or 6 potential tests that have come up from people responding to it, and yeah, so I think it's definitely one of the ones that we'll be considering, I think. And one thing that I would point out here, you know, the different tests have different merits. OET is kind of well known for kind of having that direct professional lens when people are going through their testing. Some people will prefer that. Some people will want to demonstrate a kind of more general knowledge of English. And so for us, kind of the priority is going to be, as long as we can make sure that we're maintaining the requirements for patient safety and effective practice, as long as we can make sure that we're maintaining that, we're going to prioritise giving people as much choice as they can possibly have when they come through this process. And particularly because if we adopted all of these proposals, we wouldn't have self-declaration of English as a first language anymore. We would imagine that probably more people will be doing tests. And as such, that's just another reason for us to make sure that people have more tests more choice in the tests that they choose to take.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect. So just sort of moving on from questions about the tests, there's a question. Can you state it very clearly that the new requirements do not apply to already registered HCPC members that have been on the register for years and have also obtained UK naturalisation in the meantime?
That should have been on my list of things to say at the start. That's a really good point. Yes, I can state that very clearly indeed. Yes, we're not going to make anybody who is a current registrant go back and retake their test. And also, yeah, if you've been living and practicing in the UK, etc., then if you weren't already a registrant, I imagine you'd be going through the UK route. There's one potential exception to this, I think, which is where somebody uses the international route to join the register, then lapses, maybe goes out of their profession for 5 or 6 years, comes back in via the international route again. They would probably have to go through this again and sit a test again or demonstrate in some other way once more that they were able to practice safely and effectively and their proficiency was good. They would have a slight advantage because they'd probably be able to demonstrate some past work experience. But again, if that was too far away, is that something we'd accept? Not totally sure. In any event, I'm probably talking about an exceptionally small number of people here. So by and large, anyone that is a current registrar won't be affected, no.
Thank you. So there's a question here about, I think this is in relation to proposal 4 about the supervised work experience, but it says there are internationally trained allied health professionals, sometimes working as healthcare support workers, where a nurse advising on the English language proficiency might be helpful, perhaps.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and one that we will take back when we consider this, because again, there's definitely that aspect of people working as part of a multi-professional team. Are you being supervised by somebody that's not necessarily from your profession, but is from a team working on the same outcomes that you are? That's something that we probably need to consider, and also people that are switching between professions but have already evidenced their proficiency by doing this. So there are a few different situations I can think of definitely where it might be appropriate for us to consider that, and it's not in our proposals at the moment. So if that's something that you think that we should be considering and would like us to perhaps have a second thought about widening this beyond HCPC registered professionals, we'd be really keen to hear your view again at the official consultation. It can be filled in online. We'll leave you a link at the end of this, and please let us know exactly what you think. And if you've got practical examples, that's even more helpful to us, and we can go away and talk to our registration team about some of the practicalities behind that and think about a proposal in a bit more depth. This is a really good example of why we consult.
Perfect. And then another question on proposal 4, would candidates have to have been registered in an English majority country and demonstrate supervised UK work experience, or would supervised UK work experience be enough to meet the English language requirements?
Yeah, good question, and I think that's to do with how I phrased it on the slide there. It should be or rather than and. So yeah, these are two separate things, and we'd accept either of them on their own. If you have them both, that's lovely as well, of course.
There's a question here about which countries are UK supervised. So I think that's about. I think they're asking what would be in the qualifying country list, the English majority,
that would probably solve some
English speaking list.
Yeah, so previous registration for the in the listed countries then, yeah. So at the moment we've not issued a country list. is the first thing to say as part of the consultation. And the reason for that, sorry about all the beeping, by the way, folks, there's a lot of conversation going on my computer in the background at the moment. The reason that we haven't issued a country list is that one of the questions we're asking people is about whether or not our kind of bar that we want to set for which countries to include is the right bar. So we can't issue a list until we're satisfied that we've reached the right bar. So we're proposing that 75% of the people in that country speak English on a day-to-day basis, right? And we would then generate the list of countries from that. There are various different lists in circulation, and a lot of the regulators use different ones. There's a UK government one as well that the visa folks use, UKVI. However, that is much shorter and claims to be based on 51% of people. So in theory, it should be much longer. For that reason, it's really important to us to make sure that we're setting this independently and we're not just taking a steer from the government. But we are going to look at other regulators as well, and it's likely that our list would turn out to look quite similar to that of NMC or GMC. And yeah, so if you had previous registration working there, we'd probably set a minimum time period, maybe a year or something like that. But if you could demonstrate that, there's really no point in us testing your English speaking proficiency. So we would try to get out of your way as you try to join the register, I think.
So we've got two people asking pretty much the same question here. So an international student whose education medium is English, and he has been working outside the UK with all the communication between staff and patients also in English. Would he be exempt from taking the English test?
So the first thing is, so the person's been educated in English, right? And so our first question is, would that be on a qualifying country? So if that was the case, and they came from one of those 75% countries, and they'd done their qualification in English, they'd go straight through. If they're working in a country that wasn't on that list, then their previous registration in a listed country wouldn't be there, and neither would the supervised work experience. So in that circumstance, we would expect you to take a test.
So another question on a very similar vein, so I think you've probably already answered this, is if a person had gained a BSc in their own language, however, went on to complete a master's in or via the UK, would they be exempt?
Probably. I can't say that with certainty because we haven't set down like a detailed definition of what we'd accept to be your primary qualification at the moment, right? But let's say, for the sake of this argument, that the master's was your primary qualification, and you had a master's in, paramedic related studies or something to that effect. 100%, you would then qualify. Okay, so that would be absolutely fine. The fact that you've got a qualification that's not taken in English doesn't count against you, basically. But that does depend on what we count as primary qualifications. And we're going to need to look in a bit of detail at that, I think. It seems counterintuitive that a person could take a qualification and then take a higher, not in English, and then take a higher qualification in English. Masters probably, but also if you consider PhDs, you literally have to do a spoken defense of your PhD as well. So we need to have a think ourselves a little bit about how to best reflect that, and make sure, again, that we're not putting any requirement to test or anything on people who've clearly demonstrated their English proficiency in the past.
There's a couple more questions about different tests. So why can't the HCPC make their own specific test assessment like PLAB as done by GMC? And then there's another question about what would the other English tests that HCPC would accept instead of IELTS? Would Duolingo be accepted?
Both good questions. So the first is to do with resource and expertise, really. So we have some oversight of educational programs that people deliver, but we are very far from being experts in setting tests or working the marking or the invigilation for them or doing the comparisons or anything like that. We really kind of don't have that background knowledge. And there's also the question of resource. So GMC is substantially better off regulator than HCPC is. The registration fees are greater, etc. So there's kind of more resource at their command to do something like that. Obviously, I think when you take your PLAB, I think you actually pay for it as well. But for us, it's a large body of administration really that we don't have to do. There are a lot of existing tests out there that we think meet our needs. And I guess as a final point, when you've got 15 professions, it probably is less practical for us than any regulator really to say about like what are the things we expect you to be able to speak English in and to lay down what we think the areas you should cover are. It's a lot easier for GMC to put something like that into the content of their testing because they're dealing with one profession really. So there are a few reasons. The second question I think was about Duolingo. This has been one of the really interesting things about this. So I didn't even know that Duolingo had like an examination system. And when we first started doing engagement around this, so a bit like the conversation we had about standards of conduct, performance and ethics before, we did some of that engagement. We've spoken to, for example, the professional bodies. We've spoken a little bit to people who are registering for the UK workforce at the moment, and educational institutions even, and Duolingo has come up a few times. Again, before we close the consultation, we can't commit to any decision on that, but it's definitely one of the ones that we'll have to consider, and it's not something that I expected before we opened up the consultation. So it's interesting. But thanks for asking, and we will let you know. Watch your space.
I'm just going to move back to the Q&A chat function because there's a sort of bit of feedback there, which is quite good to have. So we currently have an international recruit and language has been a concern. We were only advised that they had passed the test, but not which test it was. I also believe that there are different elements in reading, writing, listening, but I'm uncertain what is acceptable. Main concern here is speaking and listening. Based on our experience levels, required should be higher, but not sure how to respond to the consultation when we don't have knowledge of what was obtained. And then someone else asked someone else. I was just going to say.
Go on.
Sorry, just to the person who's asked for the consultation link, that will be ahead in the presentation, but I can post it in the chat as well.
That's really useful. If it's possible, please, Madeline, if you could post in a link as well to our current requirements, because they do shed some light on this. So I think I said 7.5 before. I think it's actually 7 at IELTS. But we also expect no element to be below 6.5. So if you say you have really good spoken English, but your written English is absolutely shocking, that wouldn't do the business from our perspective. It still wouldn't qualify you, and we'll adapt the same approach with any other tests that we take on as well. So I think the question that you need to answer is the person you're working with on the register, because we have to make sure that they've got those qualifications, that they fit our bill, basically. If you are concerned about somebody's English speaking ability, there's also the prospect that they're not meeting our standards. And if that's the case, once you've made an attempt to deal with it locally, you've looked up the requirements and you've found out whether or not the person has met them enough to get onto the register. Once you've been and checked those things, you may want to consider raising a fitness to practice concern about the person, because they have to meet our standards on English language, and if they're not meeting them, then that is potentially a problem. But we do always encourage people to try and solve things within the workplace first, I think, is the important thing to take away here. So even if there is something like you think it's potentially sketchy about whether they meet our standards or not, but you know that they are registered, then you might want to consider other things that you can do to train that person and upskill them before you consider sort of raising a concern with us. But it is an option, and it's probably something that should be considered once appropriate steps have been taken on your end.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions in the chat box about the current registration process for international applicants. So there's someone asking about the current ban for IELTS, whether their IELTS could expire, and then someone else has also asked a question about a Filipino OT that they work with. So for that, I've just posted in the link for the international applicants webpage, because I think that will probably be more useful for you. There's another question about whether it would be possible to combine 2 IELTS tests to meet the standards.
Yeah, again, an interesting question. So this is something that NMC looked at, and it's something that we're not including in our proposals at the moment, combining of test scores. And I think the reason for that really is about making sure that this is simple and clear, both for registrants and also the people in our in our registration team. But again, in the consultation, we do ask a general question at the end, and one of those is, should we be considering anything else that isn't covered here? And if you think that's something that we should be looking at, then again, we'd be keen to hear from you. So please let us know when you respond, and I hope that you will be able to take a look at the full document, because that's really the bit that we're allowed to take into consideration. So please let us know. Thanks.
There's another question about whether the training courses have a requirement to check English before accepting onto their HCPC courses, or is it just as long as they get through the course in English, does that mean it's fine?
Another great question. So pretty much all of the courses, I think, do set a requirement that you are able to meet HCPC standards, and include with that, they tend to include explicitly the English language part of this. So in practice, basically, yes, education programs that give you primary qualifications and put you onto the register do tend to set that requirement. But what I will say is that that is not within our area of competence as HCPC. That's really one for educational institutions to decide whether they want to do that or not. We would obviously argue that it's a lot fairer on applicants to tell them what those requirements are, because otherwise, they'll have people sitting a course that are not qualified to get onto HCPC's register, and I think that's probably best avoided. But one of the things that we do need to do throughout the consultation and as we implement is make sure that we keep on talking to those educational institutions, because they're going to have to be up to date with what our requirements are in order to make those decisions about what they ask for from potential students. Yeah, so that's really a conversation and part of our communication that we need to make sure we pay attention to as this goes forward. And on that point about implementation, most of this won't start to filter through into being our actual policy and something that we're carrying out until some distance into next year, because, as I say, the consultation isn't even closing until January, and then after that we'll have to have a period where we go away and reconsider everything that's come up through it. So we can't commit to a timeline yet about when we're going to be embedding these changes, but we'll be able to give you a better idea by springtime next year, I think. Should we maybe move on to, I'm not sure how many more questions there are, but I'm just conscious of the need to move on a little bit.
I was just going to say the same thing. There's a few comments about the kind of process more widely, but I think it's probably better to just go on with the rest of the slides for now.
Yeah. Sorry if we haven't dealt with your point. We will have some questions at the end, though. Yeah, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about the aims and likely benefits, and we'll talk specifically a little bit about employers and questions that employers might want to consider in a couple of slides further in the presentation. But just to talk about what we're trying to produce from our own perspective. So as I said, it's a long time since we've reviewed this policy, and we're trying to make sure that we're harmonising with the rest of our sector in regulating health and care. Also, a motivation for us undertaking this work. We've had a small number of cases, but nevertheless important things to be raised with us that have come from employers where registrants allegedly lacked sufficient English skills. And a really good example is that one we heard from about 5 minutes ago. So they've not necessarily been people that have been submitted into our fitness to practice process. It may not be that serious, or it may be that someone's asking advice about whether to even do that. But nevertheless, it's ended up at our door. Now, what we don't have is mass numbers of these. So we don't have hundreds of people coming to us and making this type of raising this type of concern with us, and it's not showing up in substantial numbers in our formal processes via fitness to practice either. So we don't think that there's a systematic kind of risk associated with the current system or anything like that. But the nature of what we do is that individual instances where these things are not treated well and robustly can still have major consequences for people. So we want to make sure that we're taking this seriously, and that's one of our motivations, I think, for doing this at all, is concerns raised by employers. So what are we going to make sure of? What are we trying to ensure whilst we're going through that? So the 3 priorities we've really set are robust, fair and clear. And we're trying to make sure that all of our proposals meet those, and that the system as a whole at the end of this meets those requirements. And what do we want to do as part of that? Well, the first thing is maintain public protection. And for us, we're a health and care regulator. Our job is that. We have a wider job, but our core role is absolutely that, and so that's the minimum baseline we're willing to set. And so for us, it's not a motivation for us really, or at least it's a secondary motivation to make sure that there's a good like workforce supply and all of that kind of thing. But we can only really do that if we're sure that the workforce supply that we're getting is capable of maintaining public protection, right? So it's a minimum principle is what I'm saying. So that's the first thing. The second thing that we want to do, we think that minimum principle is met by our current level of proficiency that we ask people for. So those scores are IELTS and TOEFL. And we think that that could apply more widely. So we want to avoid changes to the level of proficiency that we require. We want to focus on the evidence that allows us to prevent any gaming of the system. So yeah, absolutely making sure that people can't cheat their way through or answer in particular ways that are more helpful to them than they would be to others. But we also need to make sure in doing that we're proportionate for applicants. As I said, like the workforce flow is a concern to us. It's just our second concern really, but it's no good for us if we produce a system that is very strict, but doesn't allow people to recruit. That's not where we want to be. And so part of what we want to hear from employers is about, are we maintaining that balance correctly, or should we be doing it in a different way? We want to make sure we're providing objective criteria for people and removing any subjective kind of verification elements like challenging self-declaration or comparing tests. And so that's part of the fair and it's part of the clear priorities, I think. Expanding the options that applicants can use to show proficiency, so that's the choice point I made earlier, and setting clear and transparent expectations. So some key things that you might want to consider as employers. So do the proposal strike an appropriate balance between public protection on the one hand and the number and diversity of new professionals entering the UK workforce on the other hand. Having a system where people can't self-declare English as a first language, that is going to have a bit of a negative equalities impact for people from some countries. And I think it's important that, you know, yes, employers should be thinking about workforce, but also please do think about diversity and equality in terms of how this applies and what it might do to the workforce when you come back with your consultation answers. Part of the motivation for the proposals is making sure that it can't be gamed, but how can we make sure that a new system is sufficiently robust? There's a question, what are employers' needs around overseas registration in listed countries or supervised work experience? So we want to make sure that this process is robust but not too bureaucratic for you. Also, definitely something that's arisen in NMC's experience, and we'll speak to other regulators about this. But it's the difficulty sometimes that people have when they're giving evidence as a supervisor as someone else. What they call supporting information from employers over at NMC. People aren't necessarily clear immediately on how to do that and when it's appropriate to do that and all of the rest of it. So what can we do to make sure that people are getting the right kind of guidance and support around this? What information do we need to provide and make available? Those are all things that we'd be really keen to hear from you about. And a last thing, and this is a question, I guess, really to the floor, how can we make sure that as many employers as possible answer the consultation? Because without hearing from you in the official stuff, again, we're not going to be able to consider your opinion officially, and that's a problem. So we need to hear from you, basically. Last thing about this, but if you've got any questions about the consultation after today or the proposals, you can contact us at this address. So it's just consultation@HCPC. And highlighted there. We'll repeat that at the end as well, so that you've got that in case you want to ask us any questions and anything comes up. Shall we do a couple more questions again, Madeline, and then move on, because I've seen some people have put a little bit more in.
Yeah, of course. So there's another comment on the chat, which is just about accents potentially being a problem rather than the level of English itself. There's a question here about if someone has a UK master's degree in their profession, can he or she apply through the UK route by adding MSc as her primary qualification? I've actually just answered their previous question, because I think this is more about an application that's ongoing. So I've put some information there that hopefully will be helpful. And if I just look at the actual Q&A box as well. There's a comment here.
Shall I come back on those two? Shall I come back on those two, Madeline, while you're
you
looking for the rest of them?
You can do. I've given some information about international applications, as I think this is more about a current application that's going on.
Yeah.
So hopefully that will help them.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really give you registration advice. Is kind of the point there. I'm not an expert in the area of what exactly would be UK or what exactly would be international. But I work with people that are, and there's some public information about it. And if that doesn't work for you, again, you can use that contact address on the last slide. We'll make sure that we put you in touch with people that can answer your question. The point about accents, yeah, absolutely, accents should not be something that enters consideration here. We are not interested in what people's accent is, and I don't think that test providers should be either. And I think that making sure, one of the things that we're informally asking test providers at the moment is, you know, what are your policies for equality, diversity, and inclusion? What are you doing to make sure that people aren't discriminated against during your processes? And we will do some work looking at the outcomes for different groups coming through the various different test providers to make sure there's no big disparities or anything like that. So it is something we're aware of, and we want to make sure that it's based on your English and not the accent that you speak it in.
Thank you. So this is just a comment on a kind of similar vein, but someone's commented in the Q&A box, similar to a previous comment, we have had a recruit who has been through an English MA. However, we have concerns about English language, particularly speaking with clients. I do have concerns that some training courses are not considering language skill or ability fully when accepting students on courses.
That's a really useful bit of feedback, and I think that's something that we can pass on to our education team as well, because I think that again, while it's not for us to say what the requirements are set by educational institutions for entry or anything like that, it is important that by the time people come out of the educational institution they attend, that they're able to meet our standards. So I think there might be a bit of a point for us to pass on to educational institutions there. So we'll feed that through to our education team, and it's useful feedback. So thank you.
There's another comment. I think this is in response to something that was said a little bit earlier, but it says, we set a requirement as part of our higher education institution recruitment process, currently IELTS and TOEFL. So yes, the conversations do need to take place so that we are complying with our HCPC requirements in advance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a risk with these proposals that we end up with people coming through training programs who then still aren't equipped to enter the register, and you know, they have to go away and do a load more work to make sure that they can show their English proficiency. And avoiding that is not really going to be so much about the proposals that we're making here, but it's going to be about making sure that we communicate those really effectively, and that educational institutions know what they are and what they should be doing about them. Yeah, so that's what we will endeavour to do once we reach a stage of implementing this. And as I say, we'll probably get around to doing some of that work in spring of next year.
Thank you. And then there's just one more question, which is NARIC currently accepted as an equivalent to IELTS?
Again, I don't know the answer to that, but as I said, we have a general duty to consider under our current policy. So if you bring a qualification and you've been through NARIC and you pass it on to our registrations team, they will then go away and see if there's a way that they can compare the elements and compare your grades to what our requirements are at the moment. Quite a lot of people have suggested NARIC as well in the feedback that we have had so far, the people that have answered the consultation. So it's something that we'll look into in a little bit more depth. But again, if there are particular reasons that you think it should or should not be accepted, we want to know what those reasons are as well. And so I suppose that's another really good reason for your organisation to put in a response to us and the official consultation. And we'll show you the link at the end. Thank you.
Thank you. That's it for questions. I've put in the email address for the consultation inbox if anyone has any further questions.
That's great. Thanks, Madeline. I saw that there was a question, what is IELTS and TOEFL? So they're different English test providers. So the first one is the international English language testing system. And so that's the one that's kind of backed up by British Council, and I think there are a couple of other organisations behind it as well. I think that Cambridge Assessment English is one of those, for example. And the second one, TOEFL, is the test of English as a foreign language, and that's the one that comes from the kind of US university background, but is now adopted in nearly 200 countries, I think. So it's quite widely used. And those are the two that we approve at the moment, but they're not the same as other regulators, and all of the regulators seem to approve different examiners. And there's a question for us as a sector, I think, there about like, well, why aren't we trying to harmonise these more? Are we ready to push on with the slides, Madeline, or have we got more questions?
Yeah, that's it for questions at the moment.
Brill. Okay, fab. So we've got the equalities impact slide ahead of us there. So if we could just go back again, sorry. So we have published this, and it's a draft equalities impact assessment, simply for the reason that the consultation's open, and we will probably have to make changes to it depending on what people say. But yes, we've published it in full. It's a very weighty document, and Madeline's done a tremendous amount of work putting it together, and we hope it's well considered. But we're really interested in what your opinions are on the things that we're saying, and whether or not you think there's anything that we've missed in particular. The main impacts that we've come across, really, so cross-cutting impacts on people that can no longer self-declare English as first language. Very obviously, that's going to apply more to people from countries that are not English-speaking ones, and so very obviously there's race and ethnicity considerations that come from that. And then for people that are not able to do that, there are potential other aspects that then come up. So if you end up having to pay for a test that you wouldn't have had to pay before, you now have a cost barrier that you otherwise wouldn't have, for example. And that also applies, so pregnancy and maternity, you can see how that would be impacted by cost as well. There are a whole set of areas that are affected by cost. So there are a couple of things that are really cross-cutting. In terms of needing to take exams, there are some other complications as well. So are those exam boards ones that treat people equally and where the results are representative? There's also the impact that protected characteristics have on people's salaries and capacity to earn. So having to pay money to do your test will be easier for people from some groups, for example, than for others. But there are some positive impacts that we've identified as well. So some applicants would face less risk of value judgments than they do under the present self-declaration regime, because we'll have no reason to come and challenge your English speaking, because it'll simply be judgeable by an objective standard. Coming from a majority English speaking country would now matter. So if you're from, for example, a lot of the Caribbean, you'd now be in a situation where that would actually matter, and it wouldn't be something where we would be talking about like, what's your first language? And so that's an advantage as well. So there are a few kind of more positive sides of it that that kind of come through also. We are really keen to hear from people that have experienced the international registration process, and that means employers as well, where you've had people use that process. We want to know what it's like for people. We want to know what it's like to recruit people from that background as well, and how members of the public are affected by it, not just the people that are applicants and registrants. We also want to know about the public and colleagues as well, and people that you work with. So all perspectives are important here. But particularly, we really want to hear from people that have protected characteristics themselves under the Equality Act, because that gives us perhaps an enhanced level of insight here. Next slide. So, yeah, further impacts, cost and work requirements. So we talked a little bit about this, race and pregnancy maybe most impacted. I mean, we've talked about the cost of sitting exams. There's also a lot of additional work there. And if you're a person that's time poor, and that may be for reasons like pregnancy and maternity, it may even be disability related, there are potential impacts there. Race, I mean, again, I touched on this before, but majority of English speaking countries, it will disproportionately impact based on race, and it won't just be about whether or not a person is white or white British, because there will be Black and minority ethnic groups that are affected by this more severely than others, and that's one of the things that we go into a little detail in the equalities impact assessment. Pregnancy and maternity, again, this has been a bit of a theme, but the requirement to take a test instead of self-declaring could affect people with childcare needs and childcare costs as well. So these are kind of some of the most obvious things that we found. But as I say, it's a very substantial document, and there's a lot more in there. So if you want to look at that in a bit of detail, please do feel free. So there are a few kind of key questions here to think about, and we could take a few questions or points back in response after we've come to the end of the presentation. We're near the end now, but these should also be useful prompts for people if your organisation is going to fill an organisational response, or if you're going to answer as an individual. In both cases, hopefully this should help a little bit. So there are a bunch of questions we put down here. So how would replacing self-declaration with a qualifying countries list affect applicants? And what would that mean for you as an employer or an employer organisation? Big question there, I think. And that balance point about, you know, the quality of applicants coming through and their English proficiency versus the quantity and the workforce supply aspect of it. We want to hear about all of that from you. Would this make you more or less confident in the proficiency of colleagues? Really important. We've heard a couple of cases today where people have got concerns about that. Would this new system help to remedy some of that, or would it make no difference, or would it be worse? You know, we would like to know. How should we draw up our list of majority English speaking countries? So as I say, we're proposing 75% English speaking, but people have different ideas about this, and we want to know what yours are. How are the proposals for registered experience overseas and supervised experience in the UK affect applicants and the public? Do we think they're good, bad? Are we indifferent? We also want to know, I suppose, again, how that would affect you as an employer, because if you've got a situation where you start needing to sign people off, or people in your organisation start needing to do that, is that going to create a massive burden for you, or is it something you think could be done quite smoothly? How can we help to make sure that it's done smoothly? All questions that could come out of this for you. Should we expand the list of test providers? Are there any in particular that we should include? What are the impacts on what I'm going to call EDI, equality, diversity and inclusion? How can your organisation best make sure that I've said members here actually, because that's a line from when we've done this session before with professional bodies, but how can you best make sure that that people in your organisation will respond and that your peers respond? And there is a question about professional bodies here. How could they assist to support people through this process? So there's a question for you as employers about that, and making sure that people, that are applicants, get the support that they need from their employer. But there's also a question about, like, well, you know, is this something that other bodies that you guys work in partnership with, is it something that they should be doing? So question for you there as well. And then the last thing, I guess, that we want to ask you is there anything else that we haven't considered here that we should be thinking about? Let's skip on to the next slide. Again, there are a lot more questions in here. I'm not going to recite all of them for you, but there are a few things in here that you may wish to take account of, and we'll skip through again if that's okay, Madeleine. Yeah, let's keep on skipping through. So yeah, so here's the timeline. So we opened on the 16th of October. The consultation will close on January the 19th. Yeah, we're not just consulting on the proposals, but we're also consulting on the equality impact assessment. So if you can read it before you answer, please do. It's really helpful for us. And for next steps, we'll analyse the results and publish final proposals and an updated EIA by spring of next year, and we'll begin implementing after that has taken place. And so by that time, we hope to be able to give you some better timelines on when we're going to be able to put all of this in place and start asking for this evidence from applicants. Next slide. So here's how you can answer. We've got this nifty QR code here. So if you've got a little bit of time on your phone, you can have a scan of that, and that will take you through to the consultation page. Or the link is just there below. So it's hcpc.org, the usual address, and then a / consultation on English language separated by dashes. As simple as we could make it, I'm afraid. But yeah, hopefully you will get there. And closing on January the 19th, end of the day. We're aware, though, that people might have some questions. What do we mean by various things, and what do we want to hear from you? And if you've got any kind of clarifying questions, or you need to speak to anybody at HCPC about this, please use the email address that we've given there. We have it for a reason. We like to talk to you. It's important for us to make sure that we're steering and informing as best that we can, really. So don't be strangers. Get in touch with us if it's remotely helpful to you. We want to hear from as many of you as possible. It is very important to us that we know what employers think about all of this, and we're able to use that to refine our proposals. So that's it. I guess we have some time to do some final questions or points or reflections that anybody has now, and we'll round off afterwards.
Yeah, there's one question in the chat that I think I might have missed from before. It's, do you ask for any proof or any kind of document if an international applicant self-declares English as their first language? If the answer is no, please clarify how you believe their language without having proof, as HCPC asks for certified documents for other things. Why not for this?
Yes, is the answer, but I can't tell you exactly what they are. So I can get a bit of detail for you on that from our registrations team. It's probably better that I put you in touch with them. Yeah, again, sorry not to be able to go into detail on that, but quite a few of the questions that have come through have been questions that would be far better answered by registrations colleagues. So I think there's a little bit for us to take away from this, because it probably would have been helpful for us to invite someone along to the session. If we repeat it, we'll make sure that there is someone from there. And in the meantime, we'll take the question away for you. But if you want to give us your contact details, you can either drop them in a private message, or you can use that email address down at the bottom there, and we'll get back to you with the detail on that.
Thank you. And then there's just one question in the Q&A box, which is, if a person gets selected in the interview without IELTS, and is there any chance for asking IELTS for the visa procedure? I think they're asking if you've taken IELTS for your visa procedure, whether you can reuse it. I think that might be the question.
Yeah, so it's a particular sort of IELTS test, I think, that we used at the moment, and I think off the top of my head it's called something like IELTS Professional, and I am not sure if that is the same one. No, IELTS Academic, that's it. And I'm not sure if that's the same one that gets asked for by UKVI. We are aware of a bit of an issue with this, actually, because some of the other regulators, once you have joined the register and satisfied their English language requirements, you can then kind of go straight through the visa process without having to sit an English test. That's not the situation with HCPC at the moment. And I was speaking to our registrations team about this morning. It is something that we are in dialogue at the moment with UKVI about, because it's if we make some of these changes, that is potentially something that they might be able to consider doing. And I think their issue with just accepting tests that we do or anything like that at the moment is they don't want to accept that because somebody's passed HCPC's process that they can just go straight through and apply for a visa. And as I say, that's not the issue with all regulators, and I think the reason that it's a particular issue with us has been that self-declaration exists. And so yeah, this is potentially one benefit of us changing the system that may come further down the line. As it goes at the moment, I think you basically have to sit a test twice. Probably a good reason to change the system, I think.
Well, thank you.
Being too biased about it.
Thank you. There aren't any more questions to either the chat box or the Q&A box, so I think that might be it for questions. There were quite a lot in the middle, so hopefully that's everything's sort of been answered now.
Well, great. I just want to say thank you to everybody for all of the questions and reflections that you've had on this. And some of it's been really useful to me because there have been a few questions that are really about the detail of registration stuff. We'll try to make sure that we give a little bit of information answering some of those things, because over the next few days you'll see a blog from me that gives a bit of an update about some of this work. So we'll try to answer some of those points in there. Thank you so much for coming along. This is super valuable for us. So I feel a little bit guilty about taking all of your kind of expertise and experience, but thank you for giving it. And please respond formally to the consultation